Two girls went on a school trip and never came home. 3 months later, their families discovered something inside a shipping container that revealed the shocking truth about what really happened that day. The autumn leaves were just beginning to turn when Riverside High School's senior class departed for their annual educational trip to the Pacific Northwest. It was October 15th, a crisp Tuesday morning that held the promise of adventure for the 47 students who had spent weeks planning and fundraising for this once-in-a-lifetime experience. The itinerary included visits to historical sites, nature, preserves, and cultural landmarks across Oregon and Washington, with the trip scheduled to last 5 days and 4 nights. Among the excited teenagers boarding the chartered bus were two best friends whose absence would soon tear through their families like a devastating storm. Jessica Chen, 17 years old with long black hair often pulled back in a practical ponytail, was known for her methodical approach to everything in life. She kept detailed journals, color-coded her class schedules, and had already been accepted to 3 universities with full scholarships. Her backpack was packed with extra batteries for her camera, backup chargers for her phone, and a carefully planned itinerary of additional sites she hoped to visit during any free time. Beside her sat Mia Rodriguez, also 17, whose infectious laugh and spontaneous nature perfectly complemented Jessica's careful planning. Where Jessica was reserved and thoughtful, Mia was outgoing and impulsive, the type of person who made friends within minutes of meeting someone. She had convinced Jessica to join the drama club sophomore year, and Jessica had helped Mia maintain the grades necessary to participate in school activities. Their friendship was one of those rare partnerships where opposite personalities created a perfect balance. The two girls had been inseparable since 8th grade, when Jessica's family moved to town and Mia had been assigned as her buddy to help her navigate the new school. Over the years, they had become more like sisters than friends, spending countless hours at each other's homes, sharing secrets, dreams, and the typical concerns of teenage life. Their families had grown close as well, celebrating holidays together and supporting each other through various life challenges. Jessica's parents, David and Linda Chen, owned a small but successful accounting firm in town. David had immigrated from Taiwan in his 20s, working multiple jobs while attending night school to earn his CPA certification. Linda, whose family had been in the area for 3 generations, met David at the community college where she was studying business administration. Together they had built a life focused on hard work, education, and family values. Jessica was their only child, and they had poured their hopes and dreams into her future, saving every penny for her college education. The Rodriguez family presented a stark contrast in structure, but shared similar values of love and dedication. Mia lived with her single mother, Carmen Rodriguez, who worked as a nurse at the regional medical center. Carmen had raised Mia alone since her divorce when Mia was 7 years old, often working double shifts to provide for her daughter, while still maintaining an active presence in her life. She never missed a school play, parent conference, or sports event, despite her demanding schedule. Mia also had a strong relationship with her older brother Carlos, who was 22, and worked as an apprentice electrician while taking night classes to complete his engineering degree. The school trip represented different things to each family. For the Chens, it was Jessica's final major high school experience before she graduated and left for college. They had encouraged her to participate, believing that travel and exposure to different places would broaden her perspective and help her become a more well-rounded person. David had even upgraded Jessica's camera equipment specifically for the trip, hoping she would document her experiences thoroughly. For Carmen Rodriguez, the trip was a significant financial stretch that she had managed through extra shifts and careful budgeting. She wanted Mia to have the same opportunities as her classmates, regardless of their family's more modest financial situation. Carmen had worked overtime for 2 months to afford the trip costs, viewing it as an investment in her daughter's education and personal growth. The morning of departure was filled with the typical chaos and excitement of any major school event. Parents gathered in the school parking lot, taking final photos and offering last-minute reminders about safety, responsibility, and staying in touch. The supervising teachers, Mr. Kenneth Walsh and Mrs. Patricia Summers, had both led school, trips before and were experienced in managing groups of teenagers away from home. Mr. Walsh, the school's history teacher and debate coach, had been organizing educational trips for over 15 years. He was known for his thorough planning and attention to detail, always carrying backup plans for various scenarios. Mrs. Summers taught environmental science and had specifically requested to accompany this trip because of its focus on ecological preservation sites. She had a reputation for being both caring and firm with students, maintaining appropriate boundaries while still being approachable when students needed guidance. The bus departure went smoothly, with students settling into seats according to their established friend groups. Jessica and Mia claimed seats near the middle of the bus, close enough to the teachers to demonstrate responsibility, but far enough back to maintain some independence. They spent the first hour of the journey reviewing their shared itinerary, taking selfies and texting updates to their families about their progress. The trip's first 2 days proceeded exactly as planned. The group visited historical museums, participated in guided nature walks, and attended educational presentations about regional ecology and Native American history. Jessica filled 2 notebooks with detailed observations and took hundreds of photographs while Mia collected brochures and postcards to create a scrapbook of their experiences. Both girls called home each evening, sharing stories about their adventures and describing the friends they had made from other schools they encountered at various sites. On the 3rd day, October 17th, the group was scheduled to visit Cascade Falls State Park, a remote location known for its pristine wilderness and spectacular waterfall views. The park required a 2-hour bus ride through increasingly remote terrain, with the final 30 minutes on narrow mountain roads that wound through dense forest. The weather forecast had predicted possible light rain, but nothing that would interfere with their planned activities. The bus arrived at the park visitor center at approximately 10 in the morning. Students were divided into smaller groups for the hiking portions of the visit, with each group assigned specific trails based on difficulty level and time constraints. Jessica and Mia, both in good physical condition from their participation in school sports, were assigned to the intermediate trail group that would hike to a scenic overlook before returning for lunch at the visitor center. Mr. Walsh led the intermediate group, which consisted of 12 students including Jessica and Mia. The trail was well marked and considered safe for supervised groups, winding through old-growth forest with several scenic stopping points along the way. The plan was to hike for 90 minutes, spend 30 minutes at the overlook for lunch and photos, then return via the same route to meet the bus by 2:30 in the afternoon. The hike began without incident. Students chatted among themselves, while Mr. Walsh pointed out various features of the forest ecosystem, connecting the experience to lessons they had covered in their environmental science classes. Jessica documented the journey with her camera, while Mia collected interesting rocks and leaves for her scrapbook project. At approximately 11:15, the group reached a trail junction where a smaller, less maintained path branched off from the main route. According to the park map, this alternate trail led to a smaller waterfall that was considered more challenging to access. Mr. Walsh gathered the group to explain that they would continue on the main trail as planned, emphasizing that the alternate route was not part of their approved itinerary. During this brief stop, several students needed to use the restroom facilities, which were located a short distance back down the trail at a previous rest area. Mr. Walsh made the decision to have the entire group return to the facilities rather than splitting up, maintaining his policy of keeping all students together at all times. The group backtracked approximately 10 minutes to reach the rest area. It was during this bathroom break that Jessica and Mia were last seen by their classmates. Several students later reported seeing the 2 girls together near the trail information board, apparently studying the posted maps and discussing something quietly between themselves. The last definitive sighting was at approximately 11:45, when another student, Kevin Martinez, remembered seeing them walking back toward the main group as everyone prepared to resume the hike. When Mr. Walsh conducted his mandatory head count before continuing the hike, Jessica and Mia were missing. Initially, he assumed they were still in the restroom or had wandered a short distance to take photos. After calling their names loudly and receiving no response, he organized the other students into a search pattern to look for the missing girls in the immediate area. The search expanded quickly as it became apparent that Jessica and Mia were not in the vicinity of the rest area. Mr. Walsh used his emergency radio to contact park rangers, while Mrs. Summers, who had remained with another group at the visitor center, was immediately notified of the situation. Within 30 minutes, a full-scale search operation was underway, involving park rangers, local emergency responders, and eventually state police and search and rescue teams. The initial search focused on the theory that the girls had become lost while attempting to rejoin their group. Rangers examined the main trail and several alternate routes, looking for any signs of the missing teenagers. Search dogs were brought in to track their scent, which was detected along the main trail but seemed to disappear completely at the trail junction, where the alternate path branched off toward the smaller waterfall. As hours passed without any trace of Jessica and Mia, the search operation expanded to cover wider areas of the park and surrounding wilderness. Helicopters conducted aerial searches while ground teams systematically examined every possible route the girls might have taken. The search continued through the night and into the following days, but no physical evidence of their presence was discovered beyond the scent trail that ended abruptly at the trail junction. The disappearance sent shockwaves through both families and the entire school community. David and Linda Chen drove through the night to reach the search area, arriving to find a command center established in the Park Visitor Center and dozens of volunteers organizing search efforts. Carmen Rodriguez arrived shortly after, having left work immediately upon receiving the call about her daughter's disappearance. The families maintained a vigil at the command center, desperately hoping for any news about their daughter's whereabouts. The search for Jessica Chen and Mia Rodriguez consumed the entire Pacific Northwest region for 2 weeks, involving hundreds of volunteers, multiple law enforcement agencies, and search and rescue teams from 3 states. Every trail, creek bed, and remote cabin within a 50-mile radius of Cascade Falls State Park was systematically examined. Despite the massive effort, the girls seemed to have vanished without leaving behind a single piece of physical evidence. Official search was eventually scaled back after 14 days, though it was never formally called off. Park rangers and local police continued periodic patrols of the area, following up on reported sightings and new tips that came in regularly from concerned citizens. The families were told that the case remained active and that investigators would continue pursuing any credible leads that emerged. 3 months had passed since that October morning when 2 best friends had simply disappeared from a school hiking trail. The absence of Jessica and Mia had fundamentally altered the lives of everyone who loved them, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond their immediate families. Each person had developed their own way of coping with the uncertainty, their own theories about what might have happened, and their own methods of maintaining hope or protecting themselves from further disappointment. David Chen had transformed from a methodical accountant into an obsessive investigator. His home office, once organized with neat rows of client files and tax documents, now resembled a detective's incident room. Maps of the Pacific Northwest covered every wall, marked with colored pins indicating search areas, potential sighting, locations, and geographical features that might be relevant to his daughter's disappearance. He had purchased professional-grade camping equipment and spent every weekend driving to remote locations, following up on tips that law enforcement had deemed too unlikely to pursue. His approach was systematic and thorough, reflecting the same attention to detail that had made him successful in his accounting practice. David maintained detailed spreadsheets tracking every piece of information related to the case, cross-referencing witness statements, timeline data, and geographical information. He had taught himself to use GPS mapping software and had created digital overlays showing weather patterns, traffic camera locations, and cell phone tower coverage for the day his daughter disappeared. Linda Chen had taken a leave of absence from the family accounting firm, unable to concentrate on work while her daughter remained missing. She had thrown herself into coordinating with other families of missing persons, joining online support groups and attending conferences about missing children cases. Her kitchen table had become a command center for organizing volunteer search efforts, maintaining contact with media outlets, and managing the social media campaigns designed to keep Jessica and Mia's story in the public eye. Where David focused on facts and data, Linda concentrated on emotional support and public awareness. She had become skilled at managing press interviews, organizing candlelight vigils, and maintaining the missing persons websites that featured regular updates about the search efforts. Her approach was to keep the girls' story visible, believing that someone somewhere had seen something that could provide the breakthrough they desperately needed. Carmen Rodriguez had returned to work at the medical center after taking 2 weeks off following Mia's disappearance, but her colleagues noticed significant changes in her demeanor and performance. The normally energetic and talkative nurse had become quiet and withdrawn, mechanically completing her duties while her mind remained focused on her missing daughter. She had requested to be assigned to the emergency department, hoping that staying busy with urgent cases would prevent her from dwelling on worst-case scenarios. Unlike the Chens, who had thrown themselves into active searching and advocacy, Carmen had adopted a more fatalistic approach to coping with the uncertainty. She maintained Mia's bedroom exactly as it had been the morning of the school trip, washing and folding clothes that would never be worn, keeping fresh flowers on the nightstand, and ensuring that everything was ready for her daughter's return. Carmen's way of maintaining hope was to continue living as if Mia would walk through the front door at any moment. Carlos Rodriguez had dropped out of his evening engineering classes to focus on his own investigation into his sister's disappearance. At 22, he had connections among young people that law enforcement couldn't access, and he had spent countless hours talking to teenagers, college students, and young adults who might have information about what happened to Mia and Jessica. His approach was more street-smart and intuitive than the methodical strategies employed by David Chen. Carlos had also become suspicious of the official investigation, believing that law enforcement had given up too quickly and hadn't pursued certain leads aggressively enough. He had developed his own theories about what might have happened, focusing on the possibility that the girls had been targeted rather than simply becoming lost in the wilderness. His investigation had led him to explore connections between missing persons cases in the region, looking for patterns that might indicate organized criminal activity. The extended families and close friends of both girls had also been profoundly affected by the disappearance. Jessica's grandparents, who lived in a retirement community an hour away, had aged visibly in the 3 months since their granddaughter vanished. They made weekly trips to visit David and Linda, bringing home-cooked meals and offering whatever emotional support they could provide, while struggling with their own grief and confusion. Mia's extended family, including aunts, uncles, and cousins, who lived throughout the region, had organized their own informal search network. They maintained contact through group text messages and social media, sharing information about potential sightings and coordinating weekend search expeditions to areas that hadn't been thoroughly examined by official search teams. The school community had implemented various memorial initiatives to honor Jessica and Mia, while maintaining hope for their safe return. Riverside High School had established a scholarship fund in their names, organized regular prayer services, and maintained a memorial garden where students and faculty could reflect and remember their missing classmates. The drama club, which Mia had been actively involved in, dedicated their fall production to her and Jessica, with the proceeds going towards search efforts and missing persons advocacy. Mr. Kenneth Walsh, the history teacher who had been leading the hiking group when the girls disappeared, had taken an extended leave of absence from teaching. The guilt and trauma of losing students under his supervision had affected him deeply, despite reassurances from school administrators and law enforcement that he had followed all proper protocols. He had voluntarily submitted to multiple interviews with investigators and had cooperated fully with internal school reviews of the incident. Mrs. Patricia Summers had returned to teaching, but had requested to be relieved of any duties involving student travel or outdoor activities. She had developed anxiety around supervising students outside the controlled environment of the classroom, second-guessing every decision and constantly counting heads even during routine activities like moving between classrooms. The environmental science teacher had also become active in advocating for improved safety protocols for school trips. The other students who had been on the trip had returned to their normal routines, but many continued to struggle with guilt, anxiety, and unanswered questions about what had happened to their classmates. Some had undergone counseling to process the trauma of being present when their friends disappeared, while others had become more cautious and protective, reluctant to participate in activities that involved any element of risk or uncertainty. Kevin Martinez, who had been the last person to report seeing Jessica and Mia before they vanished, had been interviewed multiple times by investigators and had developed a detailed memory of that final interaction. He described seeing them near the trail information board, apparently engaged in serious conversation about something they were studying on the posted maps. Kevin remembered that they had seemed focused and determined rather than lost or confused, which had led investigators to theorize that the girls had made a deliberate decision to explore something they had seen on the trail maps. The broader community had rallied around both families in the immediate aftermath of the disappearance, organizing meal trains, fundraising efforts, and volunteer search parties. However, as weeks turned into months without any significant developments, some of that initial support had naturally diminished as people returned to their own daily responsibilities and concerns. Local businesses had maintained missing persons posters in their windows, and several had established permanent collection points for donations to support the ongoing search efforts. The regional media had initially covered the story extensively, but coverage had gradually decreased as other news events took precedence, and no new developments emerged to renew public interest. Despite the lack of concrete progress, both families had received hundreds of tips, leads, and reported sightings from people throughout the region and beyond. David Chen had cataloged every piece of information, no matter how unlikely it seemed, while Carmen Rodriguez had grown increasingly skeptical of reports that seemed to offer false hope. The constant stream of potential leads had become both a source of hope and a source of additional stress, as each new possibility required emotional energy to process and investigate. The financial impact of the ongoing search efforts had also become significant for both families. David and Linda had spent thousands of dollars on private investigators, specialized equipment, and travel expenses related to following up on potential leads. Carmen had reduced her work hours to make time for search activities, resulting in decreased income at a time when she needed additional resources to support her efforts to find Mia. Law enforcement agencies had also been affected by the case, with investigators dedicating substantial resources to the search while managing other active cases and responsibilities. Detective Sarah Morrison, who had been assigned as the primary investigator, had conducted hundreds of interviews and followed up on countless tips, but had been unable to develop any solid leads that might explain what had happened to Jessica and Mia. The disappearance had raised questions about safety protocols for school trips, wilderness area management, and coordination between different law enforcement agencies during large-scale search operations. Educational institutions throughout the region had reviewed and updated their policies regarding student travel, while park services had implemented additional safety measures and communication systems. As the 3-month mark approached, the investigation remained active, but had settled into a routine of following up on periodic tips and maintaining awareness within the law enforcement community. The families had established their own patterns of coping and searching, each person finding ways to maintain hope while protecting themselves from the emotional toll of constant uncertainty and disappointment. The call came on a gray Thursday morning in January, exactly 3 months and 2 days after Jessica Chen and Mia Rodriguez had vanished from the hiking trail at Cascade Falls State Park. Detective Sarah Morrison was reviewing case files at her desk when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize, displaying an area code from the Port of Seattle. "Detective Morrison, this is Captain Jake Hendricks with Seattle Port Authority. We've got something here that might be connected to your missing persons case from October. 2 teenage girls who disappeared on a school trip." Morrison immediately sat up straighter, her attention fully focused. After months of dead-end leads and false sightings, she had learned to manage her expectations, but something in the port captain's voice suggested this call might be different from the dozens of others she had received. "Yes, Jessica Chen and Mia Rodriguez, what do you have?" Captain Hendricks explained that dock workers had been conducting a routine inspection of shipping containers that had been abandoned at the port for several months. These containers, which had arrived on cargo ships from various international locations, had been left unclaimed by their supposed recipients and were being processed for either return to their origins or disposal of their contents. "We found personal items belonging to 2 teenage girls in one of the containers," Hendricks continued. "Backpacks with school identification, cell phones, and what appears to be some kind of journal or diary. The names on the school IDs match your missing persons case. Morrison felt her heart rate increase as she grabbed a pen and notepad. What kind of container? Where did it come from? Standard 40-foot shipping container arrived on a cargo vessel from Vancouver, Canada about 6 weeks ago. The manifest listed the recipient as a logistics company that doesn't exist at the address provided. We've been trying to track down the actual recipient, but the paperwork appears to be fraudulent. The detective was already reaching for her car keys as she continued the conversation. Captain Hendricks, I need you to secure that container immediately. Don't let anyone else handle the contents, and I'll be there within the hour with a forensics team. As she drove toward Seattle, Morrison called David Chen and Carmen Rodriguez to inform them of the development. Both parents had been waiting for this type of call for months, but when it finally came, the reality was almost overwhelming. David's hands shook as he took notes about the location and details, while Carmen initially couldn't speak at all, processing the implications of their daughter's belongings being found in a shipping container rather than somewhere in the wilderness, where everyone had been searching. What does this mean? Carmen finally managed to ask. Why would their things be in a shipping container? Morrison had to admit she didn't have answers yet, but promised to keep both families informed as the investigation developed. She also advised them that this discovery would likely change the entire direction of the case, shifting from a wilderness search and rescue operation to a potential kidnapping and trafficking investigation. The port of Seattle sprawled across Elliott Bay like a massive industrial complex, with towering cranes, endless rows of shipping containers, and constant activity as cargo ships arrived and departed from ports around the world. Morrison had visited the port several times during her career, usually in connection with drug smuggling or customs violations, but never for a missing persons case involving teenagers. Captain Hendricks met her at the security gate, a weathered man in his 50s who had worked in maritime logistics for over 2 decades. He explained that the port handled thousands of containers every month, and it wasn't unusual for some shipments to be abandoned or improperly documented. However, finding personal belongings of missing persons was unprecedented in his experience. The container is in Section D about halfway back, Hendricks explained as they drove through the maze of stacked containers. My crew found it during a routine inspection this morning. They were checking for hazardous materials or perishable goods that might need special handling. The container in question sat among hundreds of others, indistinguishable from the outside except for a series of numbers and letters painted on its sides. Hendricks had already arranged for the area to be cordoned off and had stationed security personnel to prevent unauthorized access until law enforcement could process the scene. Morrison's forensics team arrived shortly after she did, along with Detective Robert Kim, who had been assisting with the missing persons case since the beginning. Together they approached the container, which had been opened by the dock workers, but not disturbed beyond the initial discovery of the personal items. The interior of the container revealed a complex and disturbing scene, rather than being empty or containing typical cargo. The space had been modified with wooden partitions creating smaller compartments, each equipped with basic sleeping accommodations, water containers, and waste facilities. The modifications appeared professional and permanent, suggesting the container had been specifically designed to transport people rather than goods. This is a human trafficking operation, Detective Kim observed grimly. The container's been converted into a mobile holding facility. Morrison nodded, photographing every detail while forensics specialists began processing potential evidence. The personal belongings that had led to the discovery were found in one of the compartments, carefully bundled together as if they had been collected and stored systematically. Jessica's backpack contained her camera, several notebooks filled with her characteristic careful handwriting, her cell phone and personal items like lip balm and hair ties. Her camera's memory card was still intact, containing photos from the first 2 days of the school trip, including several pictures of the trail system at Cascade Falls State Park, taken on the morning she and Mia disappeared. Mia's belongings included her own backpack with school supplies, her cell phone, a small collection of the rocks and leaves she had been gathering for her scrapbook project, and a leather bracelet that her brother Carlos had given her for her birthday. Both phones had been powered off, but the forensics team was hopeful they might be able to recover data that could provide clues about what had happened to the girls. More disturbing than the personal belongings was what else the container revealed about its recent use. The sleeping areas showed evidence of recent occupation, with blankets that still held traces of human scent and personal items that suggested multiple people had been held in the space over a period of time. Water containers had been recently refilled, and the waste facilities showed signs of regular use. Detective Morrison carefully examined the modification work inside the container, noting that the construction was professional quality and would have required significant time and resources to complete. The ventilation system included battery-powered fans and air filters, while the sleeping compartments had been designed to maximize the number of people who could be transported while maintaining minimal living conditions. "Someone put a lot of planning into this operation," she observed to Detective Kim. "This isn't some improvised setup. They've been moving people in containers like this systematically." The forensics team discovered additional evidence that suggested the container had been used multiple times for human transport. Hair samples, fingerprints, and fabric fibers indicated that numerous people had been held in the space, likely for extended periods during ocean transport. The evidence suggested an organized trafficking network that used shipping containers to move people between international ports. Captain Hendricks provided investigators with detailed documentation about the container's journey. According to shipping records, it had originated at the port of Vancouver and had been in transit for approximately 3 weeks before arriving in Seattle. The manifest indicated it was part of a shipment of industrial equipment bound for a logistics company. But further investigation revealed that the recipient company was fictitious and the paperwork was fraudulent. "We're looking at a sophisticated operation," Morrison explained to her supervisor during a phone briefing. "They're using legitimate shipping channels to transport people, probably victims of trafficking between international ports. The girls' belongings being in this container suggests they were taken from the trail and transported to Vancouver, then shipped here as part of a larger trafficking network." The discovery immediately changed the scope and focus of the investigation. Rather than continuing to search wilderness areas around Cascade Falls State Park, law enforcement resources were redirected toward investigating international trafficking networks operating between Canadian and American ports. Immigration authorities, customs officials, and international law enforcement agencies were brought into the case. Morrison contacted David Chen and Carmen Rodriguez to provide an update on the discovery and explain what it meant for the search for their daughters. The news was both encouraging and terrifying. Encouraging because it provided the first concrete evidence about what had happened to Jessica and Mia, but terrifying because it suggested they had been victims of an organized criminal network. "Does this mean they're still alive?" David asked during the phone conversation, his voice strained with emotion. Morrison had to be honest about the uncertainty. "We don't know yet, Mr. Chen. Finding their belongings in the container tells us they were transported through this trafficking network, but we don't have information about where they are now or their current condition. What we do know is that this gives us our first real lead in 3 months, and we're going to follow it aggressively." Carmen Rodriguez's reaction was different but equally intense. "My daughter was in that container," she said quietly. "She was trapped in that space, probably terrified, not knowing what was happening to her." The emotional impact on both families was profound. For 3 months, they had imagined various scenarios about what might have happened to their daughters. But the reality of discovering evidence of organized trafficking was more disturbing than many of the possibilities they had considered. The container represented a level of criminal sophistication and international scope that made the search exponentially more complex. Detective Kim began coordinating with federal agencies to investigate the trafficking network. The container would be thoroughly processed for additional evidence, while investigators would trace its movement through various ports and attempt to identify other containers that might be part of the same operation. The investigation would require collaboration with Canadian authorities and potentially other international law enforcement agencies. Morrison also arranged for both families to be briefed by specialists in human trafficking cases, helping them understand what their daughters might have experienced and what the recovery process might involve if they were found alive. The briefing would be difficult but necessary, preparing the families for the realities of trafficking investigations and the potential challenges ahead. The discovery at the Port of Seattle had transformed the case from a local missing persons investigation into an international trafficking case involving multiple jurisdictions and law enforcement agencies. While it provided the first concrete evidence about what had happened to Jessica Chen and Mia Rodriguez, it also revealed the complexity and scope of the criminal network that had taken them. As news of the discovery spread, it would soon reach other families whose loved ones had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, potentially connecting Jessica and Mia's case to a broader pattern of trafficking activity that stretched across international borders and involved sophisticated criminal organizations operating within legitimate shipping networks. The revelation that Jessica and Mia's belongings had been found in a shipping container designed for human trafficking sent shockwaves through both families. But their reactions to this devastating news couldn't have been more different. What had once been a unified front of desperate parents searching for their missing daughters quickly fractured into conflicting approaches, competing theories, and painful disagreements about how to move forward. David Chen's response was immediate and intense. Within hours of Detective Morrison's call, he had converted his home office into what resembled a war room focused on international trafficking networks. The maps of Pacific Northwest wilderness areas came down from his walls, replaced by shipping route charts, port authority diagrams, and organizational charts attempting to diagram how trafficking operations moved people across international borders. His methodical accounting mind seized on this new direction with an almost manic energy. "This changes everything," David told his wife Linda during their first conversation after receiving the news. "We've been looking in the wrong places for 3 months. Jessica isn't lost in some forest. She's been taken by criminals, which means there are records, there are patterns, there are ways to track these people down." David immediately began researching everything he could find about human trafficking between Canada and the United States. He purchased books written by former law enforcement officers, subscribed to databases that tracked shipping manifests, and began teaching himself about maritime law and international jurisdiction issues. His approach was to become an expert in the field, believing that knowledge would give him the tools necessary to find his daughter. Linda Chen found herself struggling to process the implications of what the shipping container discovery meant. For 3 months, she had maintained hope by focusing on search and rescue scenarios where Jessica might still be found safe in some remote location. The trafficking revelation forced her to confront much darker possibilities about what her daughter might have experienced and could still be experiencing. "I can't think about what she's been through," Linda confided to Carmen Rodriguez during one of their phone conversations. "When I imagine her trapped in that container, scared and confused, not knowing what was happening to her, I can barely function. How do we keep hoping when we know what these people do to their victims?" Linda's coping mechanism had been built around maintaining Jessica's visibility in the public eye and coordinating community support efforts. The trafficking revelation made those activities feel inadequate and naive. Organizing vigils and managing social media campaigns seemed pointless when dealing with international criminal networks that operated in shadows and moved people across borders like cargo. Carmen Rodriguez's reaction was fundamentally different from both Chen's. Where David threw himself into research and Linda struggled with the implications, Carmen found herself retreating into a protective shell of denial and anger. The nursing training that had taught her to compartmentalize traumatic situations allowed her to function professionally, but she couldn't apply the same emotional distance to her daughter's situation. "I don't want to hear about trafficking networks and shipping containers," Carmen told her son Carlos during a heated conversation 2 days after the discovery. "I want my daughter back. I don't care about understanding how these criminals operate or learning about international law enforcement. I just want Mia home." Carmen's anger wasn't directed only at the criminals who had taken her daughter. She found herself furious with the school officials who had lost track of the girls, with the park rangers who had failed to find them, and with law enforcement agencies that had spent 3 months searching in the wrong places. The trafficking revelation felt like validation that everyone in authority had been incompetent from the beginning. Carlos Rodriguez embraced the new direction of the investigation with the same intensity his mother rejected. At 22, he had the energy and street-smart instincts that made him believe he could succeed where official investigators had failed. The trafficking angle aligned with suspicions he had developed during his own independent investigation over the previous 3 months. "I knew something like this was happening," Carlos told his mother. "Random disappearances from hiking trails. Don't make sense, but organized criminals targeting specific victims, that's something you can investigate and track down. This gives us something concrete to work with." Carlos had already been exploring connections between missing persons cases in the region, and the trafficking revelation allowed him to expand his research to include international networks. He began contacting families of other missing persons, looking for patterns that might indicate their loved ones had been taken by the same organization that had captured Jessica and Mia. The fundamental disagreement between the families wasn't just about investigative approaches. It reflected deeper philosophical differences about how to cope with trauma and uncertainty. David Chen believed that knowledge and systematic analysis would lead to answers, while Carmen Rodriguez felt that too much knowledge about the trafficking industry would make it impossible to maintain hope for her daughter's safe return. Linda Chen found herself caught between these competing approaches. She understood David's need to research and analyze, but she also empathized with Carmen's desire to protect herself from the darkest possibilities. Linda's background in business administration gave her skills in project management and coordination, but she struggled to apply those abilities to a situation that felt completely beyond her control. The discovery also created tension within each family unit. David's obsessive research into trafficking networks began consuming all of his time and energy, leaving Linda to manage their accounting business alone, while dealing with her own grief and trauma. His detailed charts and databases became barriers. Between them, physical representations of his inability to connect emotionally with what they were experiencing. "You're treating this like a business problem that can be solved with spreadsheets and data analysis," Linda accused David during one of their increasingly frequent arguments. "Our daughter was kidnapped by criminals. She's probably being held somewhere against her will, and you're sitting here making organizational charts instead of dealing with what that means for our family." David's response revealed the depth of his desperation and his inability to confront the emotional reality of their situation. "If I don't stay focused on finding her, who will? The police are overwhelmed with other cases. The FBI has hundreds of trafficking investigations. If we don't become experts in this field, if we don't push the investigation forward ourselves, Jessica could disappear forever into this system." Carmen Rodriguez faced different but equally difficult challenges with her son, Carlos. His enthusiasm for investigating trafficking networks felt like a betrayal of Mia's memory and an acceptance that his sister had become a victim of the worst kinds of criminal abuse. Carmen wanted to maintain the fiction that Mia might still be found unharmed, while Carlos insisted on confronting the reality of what trafficking victims typically experienced. "You need to prepare yourself for what we might find," Carlos told his mother during one particularly difficult conversation. "These trafficking operations don't just transport people. They exploit them, they abuse them, and they dispose of them when they're no longer useful. If we're going to help Mia, we have to understand what she's been through and what condition she might be in when we find her." Carmen's response was to shut down communication about the investigation entirely. She refused to discuss trafficking. Networks wouldn't listen to updates from Detective Morrison, and rejected Carlos's attempts to involve her in research activities. Her coping mechanism was to maintain her routine at the medical center and continue preparing Mia's bedroom for her daughter's return, as if the trafficking revelation had never happened. The extended families and community members who had supported both families during the initial search found themselves unsure how to respond to the trafficking revelation. The wilderness search efforts that had brought people together in a common cause no longer seemed relevant, while the international scope of trafficking investigations felt beyond the reach of local community support. Jessica's grandparents struggled to understand how their granddaughter could have been taken from a supervised school trip and transported across international borders without anyone noticing. Their attempts to offer comfort and support were met with David's obsessive research activities and Linda's emotional withdrawal, leaving them feeling helpless and excluded from the investigation efforts. Mia's extended family, including aunts, uncles, and cousins, found themselves divided between supporting Carmen's need for emotional protection and Carlos's determination to pursue the trafficking investigation aggressively. Family gatherings became tense affairs where conversations about the case were carefully avoided to prevent triggering Carmen's defensive reactions. The school community also struggled to process the trafficking revelation. The initial response had focused on wilderness safety and supervision protocols, but the discovery that students had been targeted by international criminals raised entirely different concerns about security and the vulnerability of school groups to organized criminal activity. Mr. Kenneth Walsh, the teacher who had been supervising the hiking group when the girls disappeared, found the trafficking revelation both relieving and terrifying. It confirmed that their disappearance hadn't been the result of his supervisory failure, but it also meant that his students had been victimized by sophisticated criminals who had specifically targeted the school group. Mrs. Patricia Summers experienced similar conflicted emotions. The trafficking angle explained why search efforts in the wilderness had been unsuccessful, but it also suggested that the girls had been taken by people who had been watching and planning, possibly for an extended period before the school trip. Detective Morrison found herself managing not only a complex international investigation, but also the divergent emotional needs and investigative approaches of the families involved. David Chen's research efforts sometimes produced useful leads, but his emotional investment made it difficult for him to maintain objectivity about the information he uncovered. Carmen Rodriguez's withdrawal from the investigation meant that Morrison couldn't rely on her input about Mia's habits, relationships, or other details that might be relevant to the case. The trafficking revelation had transformed the case from a local tragedy that unified the community in search efforts into a complex international investigation that divided the families and left community members uncertain about how to provide meaningful support. The discovery of the shipping container had provided the first concrete evidence about what happened to Jessica and Mia, but it had also revealed the scope and sophistication of the criminal network that had taken them, making their recovery seem simultaneously more possible and more unlikely than ever before. Despite the family conflicts and disagreements about how to proceed, David Chen couldn't resist the pull of the investigation. The shipping container discovery had given him the first concrete lead in 3 months, and his analytical mind refused to let the opportunity slip away, while law enforcement agencies coordinated their international efforts. 3 days after Detective Morrison's briefing about the trafficking revelation, David made a decision that would fracture his family's unity even further. He called in sick to work, telling Linda he needed time to process the latest developments, but instead drove directly to the Port of Seattle. His plan was simple: examine the shipping manifests, interview dock workers who might have seen the container being loaded or unloaded, and gather information that might help identify other containers used by the same trafficking network. David had convinced himself that his accounting background gave him skills in document analysis that might reveal patterns law enforcement had overlooked. The Port of Seattle was a maze of industrial activity that operated 24 hours a day, with unique cargo ships arriving and departing on schedules that David had spent the previous evening memorizing. He had studied Port Authority websites, shipping company databases, and maritime logistics forums to understand how containers moved through the system and where documentation might be accessed by someone with legitimate business reasons for being there. David's first stop was the administrative offices, where he presented himself as a consultant investigating shipping irregularities for an insurance company. His accounting credentials and professional demeanor allowed him to gain access to shipping records that might have been denied to someone who appeared to be conducting a personal investigation. The deception felt justified given the urgency of finding his daughter. The manifest for the container that had held Jessica and Mia's belongings revealed several anomalies that David's trained eye immediately recognized. The recipient company, Northwest Logistics Solutions, had an address that corresponded to a vacant lot in an industrial district south of Seattle. The phone number listed on the paperwork had been disconnected, and the business license number didn't exist in Washington state records. More significantly, David discovered that Northwest Logistics Solutions had been listed as the recipient for 17 other containers that had arrived at the Port of Seattle over the previous 8 months. All of these shipments had originated from the Port of Vancouver, and all had been abandoned when the fictitious company failed to claim them. The pattern suggested a systematic operation using fraudulent documentation to import containers whose real contents and purpose were hidden from port authorities. David spent 4 hours in the Port Authority offices, photographing documents with his phone and taking detailed notes about shipping dates, vessel names, and container identification numbers. The administrative staff, believing he was conducting legitimate insurance business, provided him with additional information about standard procedures for handling abandoned containers and the timeline for processing unclaimed shipments. His next step was to locate dock workers who might have been involved in handling the specific container that had held his daughter's belongings. David walked through the massive port facility, approaching workers during their break times and explaining that he was investigating insurance claims related to damaged cargo. Most workers were helpful, but had no specific memory of individual containers given the hundreds they processed each week. However, David's persistence paid off when he encountered Marcus Williams, a crane operator who had worked at the port for over 15 years. Marcus had a reputation for paying attention to unusual details, and he remembered the container in question because of irregularities in its weight distribution and the urgent instructions he had received about its placement in the storage yard. That container was lighter than the manifest indicated, Marcus told David during their conversation near the loading docks. When you're operating cranes all day, you develop a feel for how much weight you're lifting. That container should have weighed twice what it actually did, based on the industrial equipment supposedly inside. Marcus also remembered receiving specific instructions about where to place the container in the storage yard, instructions that had come from someone other than his usual supervisor. The container had been positioned in a section typically reserved for expedited processing, even though the paperwork indicated standard handling procedures. Someone wanted that container easily accessible, Marcus explained. Usually, abandoned cargo gets moved to the back sections where it sits for months before being processed. But this one was kept up front, like someone expected it to be claimed quickly. David pressed Marcus for more details about who had given the special handling instructions, but the crane operator couldn't provide specific names or descriptions. The instructions had come through the normal chain of command, but Marcus suspected they had originated from someone outside the Port Authority's standard procedures. Armed with this information, David decided to expand his investigation to the Port of Vancouver, where the container had originated. His plan was to drive north across the Canadian border and conduct similar research at the shipping facility, where Jessica and Mia had likely been loaded into the container system. The drive would take approximately 3 hours, and David calculated he could complete his investigation and return home before Linda discovered his absence. The decision to cross international borders while conducting an unauthorized investigation was risky, but David felt he had no choice. Law enforcement agencies were bound by jurisdictional limitations and diplomatic protocols that could delay their investigation for weeks or months, while his daughter might be moved again or disappear entirely into the trafficking network during that time. David's border crossing was routine, with Canadian customs officials accepting his explanation that he was visiting Vancouver on business related to his accounting practice. He had prepared documentation supporting this cover story, including fictional client information and meeting schedules that would justify his presence in the city. The Port of Vancouver was even larger and more complex than the Seattle facility, with cargo operations spread across multiple terminals and processing areas. David's approach was similar to his Seattle investigation, but he encountered greater resistance from Port Authority staff, who were less willing to provide information to someone claiming to represent an American insurance company. After several hours of limited success accessing official records, David decided to focus on direct observation and informal conversations with dock workers. He positioned himself near areas where containers were loaded and unloaded, watching for patterns that might indicate trafficking operations and approaching workers during shift changes when they might be more willing to talk. His breakthrough came when he encountered Elena Vasquez, a customs inspector who had noticed irregularities in shipping documentation over the previous several months. Elena had flagged multiple containers for additional inspection based on discrepancies between manifests and actual contents, but her reports had been dismissed by supervisors who prioritized processing speed over thorough examination. "There's something organized happening here," Elena told David during their conversation in a coffee shop near the port. "The same fake company names keep appearing on manifests, The containers are always lighter than they should be, and they're always claimed within hours of arrival, before we can conduct proper inspections. Elena had kept copies of the suspicious manifests, documenting patterns that she believed indicated systematic customs fraud or smuggling operations. Her records showed that containers matching the profile of the one containing Jessica and Mia's belongings had been processed approximately twice per month over the previous year, always following the same pattern of fraudulent documentation and expedited handling. More importantly, Elena had observed the people who claimed these suspicious containers. They were always well-dressed professionals who presented proper paperwork and identification, but they didn't behave like typical shipping company representatives. They worked in teams, communicated through hand signals rather than radio or phone calls, and transported the containers to locations outside the port's normal shipping networks. "I tried to follow one of the trucks once," Elena admitted to David. "It went to an industrial area near the Fraser River, but I lost track of it in a maze of warehouses and storage facilities. I reported what I saw, but my supervisor said I was exceeding my authority and told me to focus on my assigned duties." David asked Elena if she would be willing to share her documentation with American law enforcement agencies, and she agreed, explaining that she had been frustrated by her inability to get Canadian authorities to take her concerns seriously. She provided David with copies of manifests, container identification numbers, and her detailed observations about the people involved in claiming the suspicious shipments. The information Elena provided gave David concrete evidence that Jessica and Mia had been transported through a sophisticated trafficking network that had been operating between Vancouver and Seattle for at least a year. The pattern of twice-monthly shipments suggested that his daughter and her friend were part of a larger operation that regularly moved people across the border using fraudulent shipping documentation. David's unauthorized investigation had revealed information that law enforcement agencies working through official channels might not have uncovered for weeks or months. However, his actions had also put him at risk of legal consequences and had been conducted without the knowledge or approval of his family or the official investigation team. As David drove back toward Seattle with Elena's documentation, he grappled with the implications of what he had discovered. The trafficking network was larger and more organized than anyone had suspected, operating with apparent impunity across international borders and using legitimate shipping channels to transport their victims. The discovery suggested that Jessica and Mia were part of a systematic operation that could have moved them anywhere in North America or beyond. The information also raised urgent questions about timing. If the trafficking network operated on a twice-monthly schedule, and if they had become aware that their container had been discovered by port authorities, they might accelerate their operations or shut down entirely to avoid detection. David realized that his investigation, while providing valuable information, might also have endangered his daughter and other victims by alerting the criminals that their activities were being monitored. David's decision to conduct an unauthorized investigation across international borders had been driven by desperation and frustration with the pace of official law enforcement efforts. However, his actions had also created new complications for the case and had been undertaken without consultation with Detective Morrison, his family, or the other parents involved in the investigation. As he approached the border crossing for his return to the United States, David prepared to face the consequences of his independent investigation, while hoping that the information he had gathered would prove valuable enough to justify the risks he had taken and the family conflicts his actions would inevitably create. David Chen's unauthorized investigation had yielded more information than he anticipated, but it also triggered a series of events that would rapidly accelerate both the official investigation and the trafficking network's attempts to cover their tracks. When he returned to Seattle and attempted to contact Detective Morrison with Elena Vasquez's documentation, he discovered that the trafficking operation had already begun shutting down their activities in response to the container discovery. Detective Morrison was initially furious that David had conducted an international investigation without authorization, but her anger quickly shifted to concern when she realized the implications of his findings. Elena's documentation provided crucial evidence about the scope and frequency of the trafficking operation, but it also indicated that the criminals were sophisticated enough to monitor law enforcement activities and adjust their operations accordingly. Mr. Chen, what you've done could have compromised our entire investigation, Morrison explained during an emergency meeting at the police station. But the information you've gathered suggests that we're dealing with a network that's been operating for over a year and may have transported dozens of victims across international borders. The documentation Elena had provided revealed that containers matching the profile of the one containing Jessica and Mia's belongings had been processed every 2 weeks for the previous 12 months, suggesting that the trafficking network had been moving approximately 24 groups of victims annually between Vancouver and Seattle. The scale of the operation was far larger than investigators had initially suspected. More urgently, Elena's contacts at the Port of Vancouver had reported unusual activity in the days following David's visit. Several containers that had been scheduled for processing had been claimed early by people presenting emergency documentation, and shipping manifests for future arrivals had been suddenly canceled or modified. The trafficking network appeared to be accelerating their timeline in response to increased scrutiny. Detective Morrison immediately contacted her counterparts at the Royal Canadian Mounted Police and the FBI's Human Trafficking Task Force, sharing Elena's documentation and requesting emergency coordination to intercept any containers that might still be in transit. The investigation had suddenly become a race against time to prevent additional victims from being moved, or to rescue those who might already be in the system. Carlos Rodriguez, who had maintained his own investigation parallel to the official efforts, received a call from one of his contacts in the shipping industry that would prove crucial to the final resolution of the case. Marcus Williams, the crane operator David had interviewed at the Port of Seattle, had remembered additional details about the suspicious container and had tracked down the truck driver who had transported it from the port. The truck driver, Jimmy Torres, had been reluctant to discuss the container initially, but Carlos's persistence and street-smart approach to questioning had eventually convinced him to share what he knew. Jimmy had transported the container to a warehouse facility in an industrial district south of Seattle, where he had witnessed activities that had made him deeply uncomfortable but afraid to report. There were people inside those containers, Jimmy told Carlos during their meeting at a truck stop outside the city. When they opened the doors, I could see them huddled together in the back. Young people, mostly girls, looking scared and confused. I knew something wasn't right, but the people running the operation made it clear that asking questions would be bad for my health. Jimmy provided Carlos with the exact address of the warehouse facility and described the people he had seen operating the trafficking network. His description matched Elena's observations about the professional teams that claimed containers at the Port of Vancouver, confirming that the same organization was operating on both sides of the border. More importantly, Jimmy revealed that the warehouse facility was still active. He had delivered another container there just 2 days earlier, and his shipping company had received requests for additional transport services to the same location within the coming week. The trafficking network was still operating, possibly moving victims through the facility, even as law enforcement agencies were coordinating their response. Carlos immediately contacted Detective Morrison with Jimmy's information, and within hours, a joint task force including Seattle Police, FBI agents, and RCMP officers had assembled to plan a coordinated raid on the warehouse facility. The operation would need to be executed quickly and carefully to avoid endangering any victims who might be held at the location. The warehouse raid took place at dawn, with tactical teams surrounding the facility while specialized rescue units prepared to provide immediate medical and psychological support to any trafficking victims they might find. Detective Morrison coordinated the operation from a command post established in a parking lot adjacent to the industrial complex. When officers breached the warehouse doors, they discovered a sophisticated trafficking operation that exceeded their worst expectations. The facility contained multiple shipping containers that had been converted into holding areas, similar to the one that had contained Jessica and Mia's belongings. However, these containers still held their human cargo, 19 young people, including several teenagers, who had been transported from various locations across the Pacific Northwest and Western Canada. Among the victims found in the warehouse was Mia Rodriguez, who had been held captive for 3 months and was suffering from malnutrition and trauma, but was alive and conscious. She was immediately transported to Seattle General Hospital, where her mother Carmen and brother Carlos were waiting to be reunited with her after 3 months of uncertainty and fear. Jessica Chen was not found among the victims at the warehouse, but Mia was able to provide investigators with crucial information about what had happened to her friend. According to Mia's account, Jessica had been transported to a different facility several weeks earlier, as part of the trafficking network's practice of separating victims to prevent them from forming alliances or planning escapes. The warehouse raid also resulted in the arrest of 7 individuals involved in the trafficking operation, including the team leaders who had been claiming containers at both the Vancouver and Seattle ports. Under interrogation, several of the arrested individuals provided information about other facilities operated by the network and the locations where additional victims might be held. Based on information obtained during the warehouse raid, law enforcement agencies conducted simultaneous operations at 3 additional facilities in Oregon and British Columbia. These raids resulted in the rescue of 31 additional trafficking victims and the arrest of 12 more individuals involved in the network's operations. Jessica Chen was found at a facility near Portland, Oregon, where she had been held for 6 weeks after being separated from Mia. Like her friend, Jessica had suffered trauma and physical abuse during her captivity, but she was alive and was immediately reunited with her parents David and Linda, who had spent 3 months fearing they might never see their daughter again. The complete resolution of the case revealed that Jessica and Mia had been targeted by the trafficking network during their school trip to Cascade Falls State Park. The criminals had been monitoring school group activities in the region, looking for opportunities to abduct victims from locations where their disappearances would initially be attributed to wilderness accidents rather than criminal activity. The network had operated for over 2 years, transporting more than 100 victims across international borders using fraudulent shipping documentation and converted cargo containers. The sophistication of their operation had allowed them to avoid detection by law enforcement agencies, until David Chen's unauthorized investigation had provided the breakthrough that led to their dismantling. Both Jessica and Mia required extensive medical treatment and psychological counseling to recover from their 3 months in captivity. But their families were finally able to begin the healing process that had been impossible during the uncertainty of their disappearance. The experience had strengthened the bonds between both families and had demonstrated the power of persistence and determination in the face of seemingly impossible circumstances. The case became a landmark investigation in international human trafficking enforcement, leading to improved coordination between American and Canadian law enforcement agencies and enhanced security procedures at major shipping ports. The documentation provided by Elena Vasquez and the testimony of victims like Jessica and Mia helped prosecutors secure convictions against all 19 individuals involved in the trafficking network. As the families worked to rebuild their lives and help their daughters recover from their traumatic experience, they also became advocates for other families facing similar circumstances, using their story to raise awareness about human trafficking and the importance of never giving up hope when a loved one disappears. The investigation had proven that, even in the darkest circumstances when faced with sophisticated criminal networks operating across international borders, the determination of families to find their loved ones could make the difference between rescue and permanent disappearance. Jessica and Mia's story became a testament to the power of love, persistence, and the refusal to accept that some people are simply lost forever. If this story of determination, family bonds, and never giving up hope has moved you, please subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories that show how ordinary people overcome extraordinary circumstances. Your support helps us continue sharing stories that inspire and remind us of the strength of the human spirit.